Recently, it was brought to my attention that a brand new Resident Evil movie was announced, and I won't lie, I'm not a big fan of the big screen adaptations of the franchise. I did enjoy the first two movies, but the rest were kind of meh. Having said that, this new movie seems to be paying a lot of homage to its source material, and I'm willing to give it a chance. That being the case, and the fact that we're on the doorsteps of Halloween, I thought what a great time to review the latest video game entry in the Resident Evil saga, Resident Evil Village. As just a fair heads up, this game has been out since April, and so yes, this will contain spoilers from the game, as I feel in order to justify my final verdict, you need to hear all the ins and outs. So if you haven't played the game yet and are planning to, you might want to switch off this video. Or, if you don't care about spoilers, or if you've already played it, definitely feel free to stick around. Resident Evil Village picks up after the events of Resident Evil 7 and features the same protagonist, Ethan Winters. Only he's now married to the somewhat moody Mia and has an infant daughter named Rose. But before we get into that, can we just take a second to admire the amazing hard work that went into the intro of this game? To sum it up, it tells the story of the village and its inhabitants that you will soon be visiting, coupled with stunning visuals. Once the story has been concluded, you'll be introduced to the game's graphics and atmosphere for the first time as it picks up in real time in Ethan's home, as Mia is reading a bedtime story to Rose. If I can say one thing that Capcom mostly does right with these games, it's completely nailing both the graphics as well as the atmosphere. But then, as Ethan and his wife Mia are about to have dinner, a group of merciless mercenaries bombards their home with gunfire, killing Mia and kidnapping both Ethan and his daughter Rose in the process. And who are these mercenaries led by? Confusingly, none other than the classic Resident Evil character, Chris Redfield. Fast forward a bit, and the vehicle transporting Ethan is viciously attacked, and everyone is killed except for our main protagonist. You start out trudging through the dark woods and snow, finding bloody dead crows along the way. The rustling of foliage can be heard around you, and eventually you come across a seemingly deserted cabin, and as you explore it, it's clear that you're not alone. And although you never encounter anything face to face here, it's clear that there's something sinister afoot. Eventually, you stumble outside of the cabin and find yourself staring at a ghostly village dwarfed by the gargantuan castle in the distance. Keep in mind that you're already somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes into this game, and it's just the setup. Soon after, you begin to explore the village itself along with its ominous warning signs. You'll see shadows off in the distance, bodies being dragged away right in front of your very eyes from unseen creatures, and clear signs that you are anything but alone. After discovering a house full of corpses, you eventually encounter your first living threat in the game: the Lycans. Part man, part wolf. Unlike traditional zombies that the Resident Evil franchise tends to put on your forefront, these creatures can bob and weave, climb walls and rooftops, and even wield weapons. You'll come across several variants of these creatures throughout the course of the game, including a terrifying Lycan behemoth, and they'll serve as the primary enemies you'll face, along with their zombie-esque counterparts. Yes, they have names, but I'm not even going to bother trying to pronounce half the names in this game. More on that later. From here, you'll come across a handful of throwaway characters who really add nothing to the overall story, and eventually you'll almost gain access to the giant castle itself until you encounter one of the game's big bads, Heisenberg.
Say my name.
Capitalizing off of Breaking Bad a little bit, aren't we, Capcom? From there, you'll meet the four lords of the game along with their leader, Mother Miranda. After narrowly escaping an insane death trap maze, you'll find yourself back in the village and near the castle entrance. Before entering, you'll be introduced to the game's morbidly obese merchant, Duke, who seems to contain everything except for the Atkins plan. My God, man, in the words of Thor's mom, eat a salad. And then you enter the castle. After a bit of exploration, you come across the main inhabitants. 3 sinister witches along with their mother, Lady Lady Dimitri... Lady Dim... Oh, hell, it's some French name, so let's just call her Lady D. No relation to Sunny D, of course. And apparently she and her daughters are some sort of vampires? The daughters can manifest themselves into some sort of flying insects before transforming into their true forms, and will continue to pursue you relentlessly throughout the castle along with the towering, yet strangely sexy Lady D herself. It's tall women. I don't know what to say. I love tall women. You'll come across several other grotesque creatures along the way, like weapon-wielding zombies and gargoyles, but your main focus will always be on the vampires. For the daughters, you'll only be able to kill them in certain rooms after you've exposed them to the cold. Once you have, Lady D will become completely enraged, and you'll have to dodge her as you make your way through the castle and solve the final puzzle. It's at this point that Lady D will transform her sexy self. Don't judge me, tall is the new sexy. Anyway, into what I can only describe as what if Cthulhu had sex with a griffin? Upon taking her down, you can collect her crystallized remains for profit, and your next objective becomes to leave the castle and find your daughter somewhere in the village below. Which makes sense. I mean, that's the main objective of the game at this point, is to find your daughter. At this point in time, I thought the game was nearing an end. After all, I'd already sank at least 5 hours into it. And in all of the stretches of media that I had seen advertised or promoted regarding this game, they all seemed to place Lady D in the limelight as if she was the main antagonist. But, come to find out from Duke, she was just the first of 4 lords that needed to be defeated, not counting Mother Miranda herself, which I instantly assumed at that point would become the final boss once all the others were destroyed. You also learn the fate of your daughter, and it's a bit morbid. She has been crystallized by Mother Miranda and horrifically separated into 4 separate flasks that you'll need to collect from each of the 4 lords in order to ultimately save her life. Fortunately, the second boss fight, Beneviento, and main area is significantly shorter. But don't let the length of gameplay fool you, as it's easily the most traumatizing section in the game, if perhaps not in all of the Resident Evil franchise. When you first enter the residence, it will be surprisingly empty. Creepy, mind you, with all of the weird-looking dolls scattered around the place, but seemingly vacant. Vacant nonetheless. Eventually, you'll find your way to the basement where you'll encounter Beneviento's prized doll, Angie. Suddenly the lights go out and everything becomes pitch black. When some of the lights come back on, you'll notice that your entire inventory has been completely wiped clean, including your weapons. What follows is a series of unsettling puzzles as you make your way through the doll workshops with only the dim light of your flashlight to guide you. Then, you hear it. The cries of an infant. It makes logical sense, right? You're in search of your infant daughter, and it seems reasonable that one of the 4 lords has hidden her somewhere captive down here, right? Yeah, about that. Enter Baby. I've played nearly every Resident Evil game in existence, and I've never encountered anything even remotely this disturbing or grotesque. I'd say that I'd expect something like this more out of a franchise like Silent Hill, but even those guys haven't dreamt up anything this terrifying. You can't even defend yourself here. Your only options are to run or hide as the lumbering abomination crawls after you with the most horrific and demonic baby cries I've ever heard. After your last close encounter with Baby, you'll return to the main floor where you'll need to battle the doll Angie as she flies around the house. You'll have to find her a grand total of 3 times and stab her with a pair of scissors in order to claim victory. It's definitely the easiest boss battle of them all, but it can still pick at you on a psychological level. Up until this point, I was fairly impressed with the game. The way it built up suspense and tension, the atmosphere, and several of the encounters you come across are crazy memorable. But then you enter the second half of the game. After making your way through the village yet again, you enter the next major area, the Reservoir, featuring Salvatore the Fish King and his many windmills. Salvatore himself looks like a flood carrier form from Halo, and the area is mostly desolate, save from a few upgraded lichens and a giant lake monster. It's slow, uneventful, and flat out boring. Even the boss fight is pretty much just a lamer version of Lady D, since it's just a large tentacle monster with a human-esque torso latched onto it somewhere. Whatever. With 3 flasks collected at this point, it's time to move on to the factory location housing the final Lord, Heisenberg. Say my name. At first, it's quite an interesting setting. The factory itself is vast with lots of machinery and an army of Heisenberg's cyborg zombies standing between you and him. However, this segment ends up going on for way too long, as the lengthy, rusty corridors and cybernetic enemies quickly become repetitive while you traverse the multiple levels and sub-levels of the factory. At least Lady D's castle felt appropriately long, considering the amount of effort that was put into her and her daughters, along with the castle's many rooms, dungeons, and rooftops. Heisenberg's factory, on the other hand, is even longer and doesn't even come close to delivering in the diversity of the castle's backdrops, enemies, mini-bosses, and the overall dread felt when you knew the lady herself was nearby. Eventually, however, you do reach the factory's boss encounter, which is essentially Heisenberg himself transformed into that giant mechanized tarantula from Wild Wild West. It's quite entertaining, actually, and you begin the battle in a heavily armed vehicle in order to weaken the monster, and then you ultimately finish him off on foot. At least in my opinion, this would have made a perfect and epic final boss battle for the game. But no, the game continues. You then switch to the perspective of Chris Redfield, and with his overpowered weaponry and near unlimited ammo, the game quickly does a 180 and transforms from a moody, dreary, and spooky survival horror experience into a full-blown, action-packed first-person shooter. Don't get me wrong. It's not that I didn't have fun with this segment, but it definitely felt extremely out of place for what the game seemingly was trying to achieve. And once that segment is over, you're still not finished. You switch back to the game's main protagonist and have to deal with the final boss, Mother Miranda. And I can safely say that after following the Heisenberg boss fight, this one seems quite dull and unfulfilling. You're in a small, closed-in space going up against a regular-sized mutant creature, and, even some of the mini-boss fights seemed more formidable than this. It was completely underwhelming and not at all satisfying. Now, had I been granted the opportunity to engineer things differently, I would have tacked on the Mother Miranda fight to the Heisenberg battle. After Heisenberg has been killed, Mother Miranda swoops in to confront Ethan while also remotely controlling the now empty husk of a mechanized monster. This, in at least my opinion, would have upped the stakes a little and provided a more satisfying final encounter. Okay, I want to make my point clear on this. Resident Evil Village is not a bad game. It's a good game with a great concept that just went on for way too long. By the time I had completed my first playthrough, I had clocked in at just under 12 hours of game time. For comparison's sake, Resident Evil 0, along with the remakes of the original Resident Evil, Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3, all clocked in about 2.5 to 4 hours. Yes, I get that, like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village has a different type of design and format, but it's still way longer than it needs to be. So, what would I have done differently? I'd keep the opening segments that led up to Lady D's castle, the castle itself, as well as the Beneviento estate experience. All encounters in these situations felt unique and memorable, and I loved them. I'll have nightmares about Baby for years to come, trust me. The Reservoir, on the other hand, could have been nixed entirely. Aside from a short encounter with Chris Redfield, it added nothing of significance or value to the story, and it had an extremely uninteresting and uncharismatic villain, and it just felt flat and boring. As for the factory, I feel like the time spent here could have easily been cut in half without taking anything away. Speeding up the process and making it feel more urgent would have made this particular segment of the game more interesting as well as replayable. But as of right now, I have no desire to revisit Heisenberg's factory at all and sink another 3 hours into the game that I'll never get back. The Chris Redfield segment, while entertaining in its own right, felt out of place and might be better suited for a more action-oriented Resident Evil game. And the final boss battle was lame and uninteresting. I still say it would have been a much better play to combine the Heisenberg and Mother Miranda fights into one glorious final endgame battle. So, how do I rate such an experience? Well, I'm going to do something a little bit different here today that I've never done before and actually give the game not 1, but 2 ratings. I still enjoyed the game, and if you're a Resident Evil fan like I am, you'll still find it to be a worthy addition to your collection. However, due to the game's overall extensive length, you may feel hard-pressed to give it more than one playthrough. That's not to say I have anything against long games, not at all. I think a game's length should be justified by the content and narrative that it offers. And at least for me, Resident Evil Village just didn't have that. Still, I think avid Resident Evil fans out there will still find enjoyment in it and a worthy addition to their collection. And for those reasons, I will say that Resident Evil Village is worth buying if you can find it on sale. But let's say you're not a Resident Evil fan and are just looking to play a game that can send shivers down your back on both an atmospheric and psychological level. Yes, Resident Evil Village does have that, and I'd still recommend playing it at least once. So for those of you who might consider yourselves to fall into this category, I'll say that Resident Evil Village is worth a rental. And on a quick side note here, I would highly recommend sticking around for after the credits because there is a very cool and entertaining after credits cutscene that definitely adds to the depth of the overall story. So, Resident Evil Village, what did you think about it? Where does it rank on your list of favorite Resident Evil games? I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below, and I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy day to sit down and watch this video. I really do hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you'll consider subscribing for more great content right here on the channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all have an absolutely wonderful, safe, and happy Halloween, and as always, I'm the Tyrant, signing off.